Welcome to a new series of the channel called Alternate History Tropes. In this series, I will be discussing tropes seen in many alternate history scenarios. We will discuss what the tropes are, why I think they are so prominent, and why I think they do or don't make any sense. In this first episode, we will be reviewing tropes surrounding Tsarist Russia. And we will be discussing two main tropes which I usually see surrounding Russia during this era. These tropes will be Russia becoming a modern and industrialized nation if the Soviets hadn't taken over, and Germany would help the Whites win the Russian Civil War if Germany won the First World War themselves. So let's start with Russia becoming an economic behemoth. It is a very popular idea in alternate history that if only the Tsar remained in power for a little bit longer, either by avoiding the First World War, winning that war, or winning the Civil War, that Russia would have been on the road to huge economic success. While it depends on the scenario how extensive this trope is utilized, in many, after a decade's time, Russia's economy and modernization would have advanced to such a point that they would have come to rival other European powers and were more successful in their industrialization than the Soviets were. Now, if we look at how Russia was doing in our own timeline, nothing of this is really noticeable. Here we have a graph of the estimated GDP of the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union. Do note as a preface that GDP is not a good indication of an economy. It's even quite bad. But it can give us some quantitative indication of an economy, which very few other numbers can provide. We can see that between 1885 and 1913 there was some quite impressive economic growth. But can we describe it as explosive? Not really. But perhaps an even better metric to look at is GDP per capita, or how much GDP each individual person in a nation theoretically produces. When your population grows, your GDP grows with it almost automatically, but your GDP per capita doesn't. If we look closely at this graph, we can see that Russia's GDP per capita was quite stagnant during this period. The GDP which the average Russian added to the economy wasn't rising. If we look at France, Germany and the US though, the average person was increasing their GDP contribution. So in terms of statistics, Russia was clearly still behind the other economic great powers. And while they were on the rise economically, it was nowhere near explosive enough to see Russia rise to actually rival the others in a short span of time. But while stats are useful, let's take a qualitative look at the situation as well. Nations like America, Britain and Germany were established modern economies. They had massive ports, railways going everywhere and back, they had industry, they had capital, they had industrial workers and more. It takes time, money and effort to build and develop these things. They don't just appear out of nowhere. And Russia was far, far behind, even if they had started constructing many of these things. Adding to this, Russia is absolutely massive. While in itself this is not necessarily an issue, America is also massive and they did great economically, but it does mean that you need more infrastructure, time, money and management to do anything, and you need more of an initial investment to get everything going. But absolutely most importantly is the political and economic situation in Russia when compared to other European states. Russia was an absolute monarchy, with a significantly less attractive economic environment than the more developed economies. The government was led by a mostly conservative absolute monarchy, with the only breaks on the power of the monarch coming from the often even more conservative nobility. While economic progress was made and more progressive reforms were done, these were done in spite of the established power of the old elites, not because of them. And any reform was an uphill battle by the more progressive forces against the old conservative elite, usually only supported by the rest of the elite to make sure that the domestic unrest is reduced. There was a capitalist class of new industrialists, but they were nothing compared to the behemoth of centuries of autocratic and nobility rule in the empire. Slow and steady reform would undoubtedly continue, but under the Tsar and his conservative nobility, there would be little radical economic reform, which would always keep Russia as a lesser economic power than the other great powers. One very specific person within this trope is Stolypin. Stolypin was made famous for his agricultural reforms in Russia, mainly ensuring that the peasantry gained the right to hold their own land in Russia. Stolypin had one major ideology: monarchism. He opposed democracy and considered modernizing the Russian economy and especially agriculture as the main way forward to progress Russia and prevent socialist insurrection. But then Stolypin was shot by a revolutionary in Kiev, meaning that he could never continue with his attempted reforms to make Russia more modernized. And as always, when anything happens in history, the immediate question that comes up is what if? What if Stolypin was successful in continuing his reforms? It is just kind of assumed that if Stolypin wasn't shot, he would have succeeded in continuing to push for more reforms. But once again, this fails to take into account the larger society and elite that Stolypin operated in, which would only drastically reform to save their own privileges and prevent insurrection at home. None of this is to deny that, slowly but steadily, Russia was building up a stronger economy. They still had great potential in terms of population and resources, which makes it seem almost inevitable that Russia will eventually rise to economic prosperity. But this would be a process that would take Russia many decades, especially as Russia during the same period would have to answer some very difficult questions about what style of government they want to have in their nation. And most importantly, while Russia is trying to slowly but steadily claw their way up economically, other economic great powers would have been growing as well, making Russia eclipsing the Europeans very difficult at best and impossible at worst. It is also important to note that Russian economic progress, especially when looking at figures like Stolypin, was mostly experienced in the agricultural sector. While that's still great, this wasn't the backbone of the advanced economies of the time. So that covers what the trope is and why, in my opinion, it is quite flawed. But where did this trope come from? In my opinion, it is a mix of two main factors. The first, and perhaps the most important one, is communism. Communism so radically altered the economy of Russia that within decades the nation was unrecognizable. Now, there are several schools of thought about whether or not the Soviet economic reforms were good, but realistically they were a mixed bag of progress and destruction. The Soviets made much of the economy a bureaucratic mess, controlled by people who really had no business regulating the economy. 5-year plans, agricultural centralization, and the mass export of grain to fuel industrialization are examples of questionable decisions by the Soviets. But on the other hand, the Soviets, at a massive cost, did manage to extremely rapidly build up Russia to be a largely urbanized and industrial society, something which would become vital for fighting the Germans somewhere down the line. But with this mixed bag of Soviet progress and destruction, it is only logical that a what-if question comes up. What if the communists weren't in power? Especially in our Western-dominated world, it makes a lot of sense that the conclusion most people would reach is, if communism wasn't in power, Russia would have to be better off, since capitalism is better than communism. But as I mentioned before, the Russian autocracy really can't be compared to liberal capitalism. The people still weren't free, the nobility held a lot of power, and the laws and the infrastructure weren't ready for large-scale industrial expansion, and most people still lived as subsistence farmers on their land. So that's the first reason why, in my opinion, this trope is so prominent. Then the second reason why this trope is so prominent is that it already existed way before World War I even began. During the 19th century, you had Britain taking every precaution to stop Russian expansionism to prevent them from becoming an even larger power. But the most well-known example of this trope actually being believed in came from the German Empire. Right before World War I, the German government and high command honestly believed that if the Germans didn't start a war before 1917, then the Russian economic and military progress would make sure that Germany cannot stand up to Russia anymore, and especially not during a two-front war with France and Russia. Germany would have to strike now or be forever eclipsed by the Russians in the future. And it wasn't just the governments. Many German intellectuals painted Russia as the big, bad and terrifying figure, which when left alone would surely become too big to defeat, splitting the world between American and Russian spheres of influence. While in the meantime, in Britain, the Heartland theory was thought up, which placed the Russian Empire in essentially the perfect position to completely dominate the entire Eurasian continent. So, it makes a lot of sense that if nations like Germany and Britain were terrified of this prospect, then surely they have some points, right? On paper, absolutely. But the arguments employed generally came down to one thing: population. Russia simply had such a lead in terms of population over the other European powers, and that is what really terrified everyone. If that massive block of population really managed to industrialize and modernize, then oh boy would they be able to dominate Europe's economy and military. But now, let's think back to the late 20th century. Who was the strongest power in the world? The United States. While India and China far eclipsed the United States, or even the Soviet Union or Europe, in terms of population, it took China decades of absolutely radical reform to catch up to America, while India still hasn't managed to eclipse individual European powers, despite being magnitudes bigger than them. And something which has to be included in the rise of China is the export of Western industries to the nation, something which Russia will very much not benefit from during this era. The main thing that most of these thinkers and alternate historians don't take into account, or at least underestimate, are the fundamental issues holding Russia back. Predictions like Russia being too strong for Germany by 1917 are ridiculous. Russia was slowly but steadily moving in the right direction. Absolutely. France was subsidizing and overseeing a Russian military reform, sure. But the fundamental issues of the Russian government, society, and army at the time were not being fixed. There was no political will from the Russian elite to fundamentally change their society and economy in such a way to allow for radical economic growth and a full modernization of their army and military. So, these are, in my opinion, the two reasons why this trope is so prominent. Communism bad, added together with the fact people during the time period itself already believed in it. So, let's move on to the second trope. We have the trope that a Germany which was victorious in the First World War would turn around and ensure that the White Movement would win the Russian Civil War. The explanation for this is that Germany wants to put back into power an autocratic monarchy like the Germans have themselves, or maybe even install a German Tsar to make Russia into some form of a puppet regime for the Germans. Now on the surface, this makes a lot of sense for the Germans. After defeating France in the West, the Germans stand on top of Europe, having made puppet regimes in Eastern Europe, defeating France again, weakening their archenemy even further. Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman empires are practically German puppet regimes and will only remain intact if Germany wills it so, and the only enemies the Germans have left are the massive British Empire and the communists trying to establish themselves in Russia. If only Germany manages to defeat these communists, then Germany has pretty much secured European supremacy. But let's take a deeper look, since a German victory is often interpreted as a full-on German victory dance. Let's first establish a basic Germany victory scenario for the First World War. Let's say that the war up to 1917 goes much the same way. Germany sends Lenin to Russia, and Russia erupts into civil war after making a peace with the Germans. Germany sends their army west and manages to break the Entente lines just before the Americans arrive in large enough numbers. The French army mutinies, and the Brits and the Americans don't manage to plug these holes. After a couple of months, the Germans have fully pushed to Paris, France has capitulated, and many British and American soldiers in France are captured by the Germans. With little hope of ever recovering the continent, after a little while, Britain and America make peace with Germany as well. What Germany takes worldwide doesn't really matter too much. They push their borders further west, they take some French and even maybe British colonies, while in the east, Germany has the Baltics, Ukraine and Belarus as puppet states. Yay, victory! But not all is well for the German Empire. German control over their new states is weak. Ukrainians, Poles, Belarusians, Communists and more are still fighting for control over the newly established German states, requiring German troops to establish order. Meanwhile, the German economy is devastated by years of war and blockades. But perhaps more importantly, the Germans themselves have been under a British naval blockade for years. Even if the Germans manage to capitulate France, who knows how long Britain will keep up their naval blockade against the Germans, further bringing down the German economy, before the Brits will finally swallow their pride and surrender. Don't think that the Brits, a month after Paris falls, simply throw in the towel. There is potential for years of more blockades upon the German state. But it's not just the economy. Perhaps even more important are the German civilians. Not only has the war been an absolute meat grinder, Germany lost critical foods import, and most people were tired of war and economic ruin in general. The victory over France would help massively in terms of domestic stability, and I'm not saying that the German government would fall or mass revolutions would occur, but Germany is still in a tough spot. Imagine being your average German, and after finally defeating the Russians in the east and the French in the west, and essentially winning the First World War, the government would declare, "We are going back to the east." This would be devastating for the morale of the German civilians, tired, hungry, and eager for the war to finally be over. It would be devastating for the German economy, which would be exhausted with or without a German victory. And it would be devastating for the German army, who would be tired of years of war and just willing to go home. Who knows how long the war against the communists would take, as the White armies are disorganized and largely located in the south and the more east of the nation, while the Bolsheviks hold the core Russian territories. While the Germans would be fighting the Bolsheviks for years, they would also need to keep establishing order in their newly taken eastern territories. It would be devastating for the Germans and a very poor economic and political move by them. Now, none of this is to say that in a similar way that the Entente powers took control over some Russian territories, the Germans would also use limited forces to fight the Bolsheviks. Perhaps while establishing order in Finland, the Germans would push a little bit further, establishing another breakaway state with a German monarch in Karelia and the surrounding territories. Perhaps the Germans push a little bit further from Ukraine, establishing a Don-Cuban state, and perhaps linking up with the Ottoman German satellite states in the Caucasus. But the idea that Germany would commit to years of continued full-scale war in Russia for some vague promise of a potentially German-friendly government afterwards is faulty. There is no unified white movement for Germany to even support. If Germany had put forward a German prince as the future Tsar upon their intervention, they would have lost the support of much of the white movement as well. If Germany simply started helping the generic white movement, it is a massive question mark who would even come to power afterward, what ideology they would support, and if they would be German friendly in any way. Because as a quick friendly reminder, only 2 years before, Germany had stripped most of the Russian economy by taking the west of the Russian Empire. Whatever ideology came to power, they would likely be very unfriendly to the new German puppet regimes and by extension Germany. If Germany wants to intervene in Russia, it would be way smarter to not take the gamble on the white movement, but instead try to strip more and more of the Russian Empire away into breakaway states, which would be a lot more loyal to Germany than some unknown ideology or person taking control over the Russian state. So, in conclusion, it is likely and perhaps even inevitable that Germany and its allies take advantage of Russia's civil war and strip even more territory from it. It is also very likely that Germany, in some limited capacity, tries to assist the white movement. But Germany intervening fully in such a way as to defeat the Bolshevik movement would be a massive risk for Germany to take, while the German economy is taking a nosedive, German relations with the rest of the world is still terrible, and Germany is busy taking control over significant new territories in Eastern Europe, a bit of land in Western Europe. They are experiencing domestic instability, the economy is in ruin, many men have died in the meat grinder of the First World War, the Germans have to prop up the weakening Ottoman and Austrian empires and their gains in the war, and the Germans are asserting authority over whatever new colonies the Germans have acquired from the French and the British. So yeah, if I was the Kaiser, I wouldn't declare that apart from all of these issues that needed solving, the entire army was not to go home yet, but instead they are all expected to turn around and push into Russia again. Now the origins of this trope are quite clear and I won't go into too much detail on it. Everyone hated the Bolsheviks, but where the democratic Entente powers weren't ready to fully commit the lives of their own population to secure a democratic Russia, an autocratic Germany would be way more assertive in establishing order in the region in a way that benefited them. It is a quite common trope, not just in this case but across any alternate timeline, that monarchies and autocracies can simply do whatever they want with no repercussions because they are the sole rulers. This is not the case. You can still push your population to the breaking point, which is something most rulers want to avoid. It is also extremely common to underestimate just how devastated Germany would be in this timeline, even after winning the First World War. A victorious Germany isn't some behemoth standing over the defeated powers like some form of god while all the other nations are in economic despair and territorial ruin. No, instead, Germany itself would also be devastated just like any victorious power would be, and Germany wouldn't be able to undertake such a massive operation in this timeline. So that concludes the first ever episode of Alternate History Tropes. Let me know in the comments what other alternate history tropes you would like to see covered, and I will add them to a list. If you enjoyed the episode and the series, then please leave a like and a comment. Even just commenting something simple like hi helps the channel out massively. For more content like this, as well as other full alternate history episodes every single Friday, feel free to subscribe. Thank you all for watching, and goodbye.